She did not cry. That was the thing that broke everyone who watched. Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of a wealthy landowner carrying his blood in her veins, walked barefoot in the summer dust behind her own family's carriage. Her shoes had worn through miles ago. Her dress clung to her skin in the July heat. And not one person inside that carriage looked back. She kept her chin up, and she kept walking. If a story like Eleanor's speaks to your heart, please subscribe. Hit that bell and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The road from Clover Creek to the Brooks estate was exactly 11 miles long. Eleanor Whitmore knew that because she had walked every single one of them, twice. The first time had been in April, when the dogwood trees were still blooming white along the fence lines, and the morning air carried just enough cool to make the walk bearable. She had told herself then that it was a temporary arrangement, that Margaret had been upset that week, more irritable than usual, and that next time, surely there would be room in the carriage. There had always been room in the carriage. That was the thing Eleanor could not stop thinking about as she walked now in the full suffocation of July, with the Virginia sun pressing down on her shoulders like a flat iron, and the dust from the carriage wheels coating her lips every time the road curved and the wind shifted wrong. There were 4 seats inside the Whitmore family carriage. Margaret occupied one. Seated rigidly, her back straight as a fence post, her silk fan moving in slow, deliberate arcs, as though even the air around her needed to be reminded of her station. Cecilia, Margaret's eldest daughter, occupied another. She was 17 and had spent the first 3 miles of the journey pressing her face to the window glass to examine her own reflection. Dorothea the younger sat across from her mother. She was 14 and had fallen asleep before they even cleared the property gate. Her bonnet tilted sideways over one ear. The 4th seat was empty. It had been empty every single time Eleanor had been made to walk this road. She did not ask about it anymore. The first time Margaret had ordered her out of the carriage 6 months ago, the morning after Eleanor had quietly corrected a ledger error that had embarrassed Margaret in front of the estate's creditors. Eleanor had stood on the gravel drive and looked at the empty seat and looked at Margaret and said very calmly, "There is space enough for me." Margaret had smiled. The kind of smile that didn't reach anything above the mouth. "There is space," she had agreed. "But not for you." And then the driver had cracked his whip, and the carriage had rolled forward, and Eleanor had stood there for 3 long seconds before her legs made the decision her pride was still arguing about. She walked. By mile 4, Eleanor had developed a system. She kept her eyes on a point about 20 feet ahead of her on the road, not on the carriage, not on the dust. It threw up, not on the shapes of her stepmother and half-sisters, visible through the oval window glass. She breathed through her nose. She kept her chin level. She thought about numbers. Numbers were reliable. Numbers did not humiliate you or leave an empty seat to make a point. In her left hand, she carried a small leather notebook worn at the corners, the strap repaired twice with kitchen twine where she kept columns of figures. What a schoolhouse would cost to build. How many children in Clover Creek between the ages of 5 and 12 who currently had no access to a schoolroom? How many families might contribute a small portion of grain or labor in exchange for their children being taught to read? 41 children. That was her most recent count. 41 children in Clover Creek who could not read their own names. Eleanor thought about those 41 children through miles 4 and 5 and 6. She thought about their faces. The Miller twins who spent their days hauling water. The Hatch boy who was 12 already and had never held a pencil. The 3 little Beaumont girls who sat outside the dry goods store on Saturdays and watched other children carry books home and said nothing because they had learned very young that wanting things that weren't offered to you was its own kind of pain. She was thinking about the Beaumont girls when the carriage stopped. It stopped so suddenly that Eleanor nearly walked into the back of it. She pulled up short blinking dust from her lashes and looked around the side of the carriage to see what had caused the halt. The entrance to the Brooks estate sat at the top of a wide, gently sloping hill. Iron gates, tall and black, stood open. A long gravel drive curved up through open pasture toward the main house, which Eleanor could see in the distance. White columns, wide porch. The kind of house that had been built slowly and well by someone who intended to stay. And sitting on a dark bay horse just inside those gates was a man. He was perhaps 35, broad across the shoulders, wearing a plain dark coat that had clearly been made for function rather than fashion. His hat was pushed back on his head at an angle that suggested he had been working before he had been watching, and he held the reins of his horse with the loose, unconscious ease of someone who had been riding since before he could read. He was looking directly at Eleanor, not at the carriage, not at the silk-gowned women visible through the window, not at the matched pair of chestnuts pulling the Whitmore vehicle with their polished brass fittings catching the midday sun. He was looking at Eleanor. And he looked not curious exactly, not pitying. He looked like a man who had just seen something that did not make sense to him and intended to figure out why. Eleanor straightened her spine and looked back at him. She had learned over 6 months of walking this road that looking down invited commentary. Eye contact at least gave people pause. The man on the bay horse held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked his horse forward past the Whitmore carriage entirely and stopped beside Eleanor. He looked down at her from the saddle. His expression was unreadable, but not unkind. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Why are you walking?" Eleanor considered the question. It deserved an honest answer, she decided. "Because the people in that carriage believe it is where I belong," she said. The man looked toward the carriage, then back at Eleanor. "And what do you believe?" Eleanor had not expected that question. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "I believe," she said, "that it is 11 miles from Clover Creek to your front gate, and I have walked all of them in shoes that were not made for the purpose, and I have not yet fallen, and I do not intend to." Something shifted in the man's expression. Not a smile precisely. Something quieter than a smile. "I'm Nathaniel Brooks," he said. "I know who you are," Eleanor said. "Everyone in the county knows who you are." "Then you have the advantage of me. Eleanor Whitmore, late of Whitmore Farm, Clover Creek." She paused. "Daughter of the late Thomas Whitmore. Bastard daughter in the terminology preferred by the woman currently sitting in his carriage." She had not meant to say that last part. It had simply come out flat and clean and honest, the way things did when you had been walking 11 miles in the July heat, and your reserves of careful discretion had burned away somewhere around mile 7. Nathaniel Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached back and untied a canteen from his saddle. He held it out to her. "You should drink something," he said, "before you walk back." Eleanor took the canteen. She drank. The water was cool, which meant he had kept it in shade somewhere, which meant he was a man who thought about details. She handed it back. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He looked back at the carriage again. Something in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the gate without another word. Eleanor watched him go. She didn't know, standing on that dusty road in the July heat, with her shoes worn through and her notebook pressed against her ribs, that what had just happened was the first sentence of a completely different story. The Brooks estate hosted 3 social events per summer. The July gathering was traditionally the largest mid-season affair, where landowners from 4 counties came to discuss crops and contracts and alliances dressed in their best clothing, and pretending the conversations were about neighborliness, when everyone understood they were about business and position. Margaret Whitmore attended every year. She attended because the Whitmore name, despite everything, Thomas's death had complicated still carried enough weight to merit an invitation, and because Margaret understood with surgical precision the relationship between social visibility and social power. If you were seen at the Brooks estate, you were someone. If you were not seen there, people began to ask questions. Eleanor was brought along because leaving her home alone for the full day was a risk Margaret had decided was not worth taking. Eleanor had access to the household accounts. Eleanor had access to Thomas Whitmore's study, which still contained documents that Margaret had not yet fully sorted through and catalogued, and where necessary made disappear. Eleanor knew about the documents. She was fairly certain Margaret knew that she knew. Neither of them had said so directly. They had reached in the 6 months since Thomas Whitmore's death a kind of armed silence on the subject. 2 people who each held a piece of something the other one wanted, maneuvering around each other with great care and absolutely no warmth. So Eleanor came to the Brooks estate. She walked the 11 miles. She arrived at the gate with dust on her hem and water from a stranger's canteen still cool in her throat. And she went to work. The Brooks estate kitchen was large and well organized, and the woman who ran it was named Clara Wide, practical with forearms like a blacksmith, and a voice that cut through noise the way a bell cuts through fog. Eleanor had met Clara twice before at previous July gatherings. Clara had a habit of handing out tasks to capable-looking people who appeared to have nothing to do, and Eleanor had learned that accepting those tasks was the most efficient way to spend the hours when Margaret did not specifically require her presence. "You," Clara said the moment Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You're the one who can add numbers." "I am," Eleanor said. "Good. Somebody's been skimming from the pantry stores, and I need the inventory reconciled against the receipts from May. You'll find everything on the table in the back room. I need it done before the supper bell." "I'll have it before the afternoon bell," Eleanor said. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she pointed toward the back room and returned to directing 3 assistants simultaneously. Eleanor went to work. The back room connected to a short hallway that ran along the east side of the house, and the hallway had a window that looked out onto the main lawn where the guests had gathered. Eleanor was not watching the guests. She was reconciling May's flour receipts against the current pantry inventory and had found after 40 minutes of careful work that someone had been recording slightly inflated receipt amounts, small enough increments to avoid obvious notice, consistent enough over 3 months to constitute a deliberate pattern when she heard voices just outside the window. She recognized Margaret's voice immediately. She recognized the other voice after a moment. It belonged to a woman named Adelaide Hartwell, whose husband owned the largest tobacco operation in the next county, and who was therefore someone Margaret treated with studied deference. "I couldn't help but notice," Adelaide said, "that your stepdaughter arrived on foot." A pause. "The girl prefers to walk," Margaret said smoothly. "She has always been unconventional. Her mother was the same way." Another pause, precisely calibrated. "What can one do?" Adelaide said. "She is useful in certain capacities." Margaret continued her voice, carrying the particular blend of resignation and tolerance that Eleanor had heard her deploy in social situations where Eleanor's existence needed to be explained away. "Thomas was fond of her. We honor that fondness." "Of course," Adelaide said, in a tone that suggested she had drawn her own conclusions and found them satisfying. Eleanor set down her pencil. She sat very still for a moment, looking at the column of numbers in front of her. She had been 8 years old when she first understood what the word bastard meant in practical terms. Not the definition, which she had known from books, but the texture of it. The way it operated in a room. The way it changed the temperature of a conversation. The way people looked at her father when she was standing beside him, and how his face did a small complicated thing that he tried to smooth away before she could see it, but she always saw it. She had been 9 when she decided she was not going to spend her life watching other people's faces do that complicated thing. She picked up her pencil. She finished the inventory reconciliation. She found the source of a small discrepancy in the flour and sugar columns traced back to a single supplier's altered receipts and wrote up her findings in clear, organized notes. Then she went to find Clara. "It's the Hensley account," Eleanor said, setting her notes on the kitchen table in front of Clara. "Look at these 3 receipts. The quantities recorded here don't match the delivery records from the same dates. Someone has been adding approximately 8 to 12 pounds per delivery and pocketing the difference in the payment." Clara looked at the notes. Her expression shifted through surprise and then into something harder and more satisfied. "How long?" she said. "At least since March. Possibly longer if the earlier records show the same pattern." Clara straightened up. "I've been trying to find that for 2 months." "It's subtle," Eleanor said. "It was meant to be." Clara studied her for a moment. "Where did you learn to read accounts like that?" "My father taught me," Eleanor said. "He said that a person who could read numbers honestly was worth more than 3 people who could read words cleverly." Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something adjacent to approval. "You're wasted walking behind a carriage," she said. It was said simply without heat as a plain statement of fact. The way you might observe that a good horse was being kept in a bad stall. Eleanor did not say anything. Because what was there to say? She knew she was wasted there. She had known it for 6 months. Knowing it and having the means to change it were two entirely different problems. Tete. She did not see Nathaniel Brooks again until late afternoon. The gathering had moved into its later social hours, the business conversations giving way to wine and lighter talk on the wide porch and lawn. Eleanor had spent the intervening time helping Clara prepare the supper service and had stepped outside for the first time in 3 hours to get water from the pump at the side of the house. She was at the pump when she heard the argument. She almost didn't recognize it as an argument at first. The voices were controlled, both of them the kind of controlled that takes considerable effort to maintain. But she had grown up in a house where the most dangerous conversations happened in quiet tones, and she knew the difference between quiet because calm and quiet because leashed. She rounded the corner of the house and stopped. Nathaniel Brooks stood on the path between the main house and the outbuildings, holding a folded paper in one hand. Across from him was a man Eleanor recognized as Philip Carver, a land attorney who worked most of the county's estate cases and who had handled Thomas Whitmore's affairs in the months after his death. "The will is legal," Carver was saying. His voice had the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome information to powerful people without being held responsible for it. "Fully executed, properly witnessed. There is nothing irregular." "I didn't ask if it was legal," Nathaniel said. "I asked if it was accurate." Carver blinked. "Those aren't different questions. They're entirely different questions." Nathaniel looked down at the paper in his hand. A legal document can record something that did not actually occur. The question of accuracy is whether what this document claims reflects what Thomas Whitmore actually intended. He signed it. His hand was shaking when he signed it, Nathaniel said. 3 people saw that. His physician saw it. You saw it, Carver. A pause. "Many people's hands shake," Carver said carefully. "Many people also change their wills in the final weeks of a serious illness under circumstances that would bear examination." Nathaniel said, "If someone with standing were to request that examination." Another pause. Longer this time. Carver looked up. For the first time, his gaze moved to the side and landed on Eleanor. Nathaniel turned. He saw her. His expression did not change exactly. But something in his posture settled the slight alteration of a man who has just decided something. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Eleanor looked at Carver. Carver was now studying the ground near his left boot with intense attention. "What document?" she said. "Your father's will," Nathaniel said. "The amended version, filed in March of this year." Eleanor went very still. "I have read the will," she said carefully. "The original will. Filed 18 months ago." "There are 2 wills on record," Nathaniel said. "The original, which names you as a beneficiary of your father's personal library and a portion of the farm income. And an amended version filed 8 weeks before your father's death, which removes those provisions entirely." The pump handle was cold under Eleanor's fingers. She had not been told. In 6 months. 6 months of walking. 11 miles. 6 months of sleeping in the East Wing room that was functionally indistinguishable from a servant's quarter. 6 months of reconciling household ledgers that allowed Margaret to maintain a lifestyle predicated on Thomas Whitmore's estate. No one had told her there was a second will. She thought about Margaret's voice through the window that afternoon. What can one do? She thought about the way Carver was studying his boot. She thought about her father's hands, which she had held at the end when the fever had made his thoughts come loose from their moorings, and he had looked at her sometimes like he was trying to say something important, and the words kept sliding away from him. She looked at Nathaniel Brooks. "What are you doing?" she said. "Why are you looking into this?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I was at the gate this morning," he said, "when your family arrived." He did not say anything else. "I didn't need to." Eleanor understood that she was looking at a man who had watched her walk 11 miles behind a carriage that had an empty seat and had decided without anyone asking him to, that the situation warranted attention. "I don't need rescuing," Eleanor said. They were standing near the south fence line now, away from the house and the guests, and Carver, who had excused himself with remarkable speed the moment Nathaniel had suggested they continue the conversation privately. "I know that," Nathaniel said. "I am not a problem to be solved." "I know that too." Eleanor studied him. He met her gaze steadily, without the particular expression men often adopted when they believed they were conferring a significant favor. The benevolent tilt, the patient indulgence. He just looked at her like she was the person talking to him, which was in her experience rarer than it should have been. "Then what is it you think you're doing?" she said. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He looked out over the fence toward the pasture, the wide, clean sweep of summer grass that ran to the tree line. "My father died when I was 19, he said. "Left this land to me and a set of debts that men around the county assumed would break me. 3 of them tried to purchase the estate at reduced value before I could establish myself. They used lawyers and pressure and certain techniques for making a young man feel that his situation was permanent and his options were limited." He looked back at her. "I know what it looks like when someone is being maneuvered out of what's theirs." Eleanor said nothing. "I'm not offering to fix your situation, Miss Whitmore. I wouldn't insult you by suggesting I could." He reached into his coat and withdrew a second document smaller than the will, a folded letter. "I'm offering you information. There's a circuit judge coming through Clover Creek in 6 weeks. He handles estate disputes. And I know a man in Richmond who can authenticate handwriting under duress, who can look at 2 versions of a document and tell you whether the signature on the second one matches the physical condition of the man who supposedly made it." Eleanor looked at the letter in his hand. She did not take it yet. "Why?" she said. It was the only question that mattered. "Because 41 children in this county can't read," he said. Eleanor blinked. "Clara told you." "Clara tells me most things that happen in my own kitchen." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face, and then was still again. "I understand you found the Hensley discrepancy in under an hour. Work my bookkeeper has been failing to locate for 2 months. It wasn't difficult once you knew where to look. That is always the nature of important things." He held the letter out again. "Take it or don't. But if you decide to take it, I'd recommend reading it before you make any decisions, and I'd recommend not letting Mrs. Whitmore see you with it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the letter. She folded it carefully and slid it into her notebook between the columns of figures for the schoolhouse that did not yet exist. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Nathaniel said. "Read the document. Then decide if there's anything worth thanking." He tipped his hat, a small, unhurried gesture, and walked back toward the house. Eleanor stood at the south fence line with the evening coming on, and the summer heat beginning finally to ease into something that breathed a little easier. In her notebook, between the numbers for 41 children, and the cost of lumber, and the estimate for a wood stove, sat a folded letter that might change everything. She had walked 11 miles to get here. She was not walking 11 miles back to nothing. The supper bell rang across the estate, and from across the lawn, Eleanor could hear the guests moving toward the house, the rustle and murmur of 30 people in fine clothes who had spent the afternoon being important and were now ready to be fed. She heard Margaret's voice among them, bright and particular, aimed with precision at Adelaide Hartwell. Eleanor pressed her notebook against her ribs. She raised her chin. And she went to help Clara serve supper, because for now, that was what she could do. And Eleanor Whitmore had learned over 24 years of being told what she could and could not have, that for now was not the same as forever. The difference between the two was information. And for the first time in 6 months, she had some. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She lay on the narrow bed in the East Wing room, the room that had once housed the Whitmore family's visiting seamstress, and still smelled faintly of lavender and old linen. And she held her notebook against her chest in the dark, and she thought about her father's hands. Thomas Whitmore had been a large man. Not tall, but substantial, the kind of man whose presence filled a room not through noise but through sheer solidity, the way a good oak fills a field. His hands had been a carpenter's hands, even though he had not worked wood in 30 years, wide-palmed and deliberate, and Eleanor had watched those hands sign 100 documents over the years. Tax records, land surveys, letters of credit, and they had always been steady. The signature always the same. The pen moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was putting his name to. She thought about what Nathaniel Brooks had said. His hand was shaking when he signed it. She thought about the last 3 weeks of her father's life. The fever that had come in February and never fully left. The days when he had known her, and the days when he hadn't. The afternoon when he had grabbed her hand and held it too tight and said very clearly, "Eleanor." The study, the lower drawer. And then Margaret had come into the room, and his eyes had gone confused again, and the moment had closed like a door. Eleanor had gone to the study afterward. The lower drawer had been empty. She sat up in the dark. She lit the small candle on the bedside table, and opened her notebook, and took out the letter Nathaniel had given her, and she read it again slowly, the way she read things that mattered. It was a name and an address. James Colton, solicitor, 14 Merchant Row, Richmond. And beneath that, in Nathaniel's handwriting, plain and unornamental, the handwriting of a man who used words to convey information rather than to perform. Colton examined the Hargrove estate documents in 1814. Handwriting under duress, tremor patterns, pressure, inconsistencies. He can tell you if the signature on the amended will was made by a man in full command of himself. He charges $15 for the examination. Send word ahead. Tell him I sent you. $15. Eleanor sat with that number for a long moment. She had $4.70 in the small tin she kept in the lining of her travel bag. She had been saving it for 8 months, small amounts, careful amounts. Coins accumulated from the few instances where Margaret had given her household money, and Eleanor had found efficiencies that left a small remainder that Margaret did not ask to account for. $4.70. She closed her eyes. Then she opened them, and she picked up her pencil, and she turned to a clean page in her notebook, and she began to plan. Margaret found her at breakfast. This was unusual. Margaret rarely descended before 9 o'clock, and Eleanor was typically finished eating and gone from the kitchen by 8:30. But this morning, Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway at 8:15, already dressed and already wearing the particular expression that meant she had been awake earlier than she wished to be, and was prepared to make that circumstance someone else's problem. "You were speaking with Nathaniel Brooks yesterday," Margaret said. Not a question. Eleanor set down her coffee cup carefully. "He offered me water when I arrived. I thanked him." "Adelaide Hartwell saw you near the south fence line with him, in the late afternoon." Eleanor had expected this. She had prepared for it the same way she prepared for everything, by thinking through the conversation in advance, mapping the points where Margaret would push, and deciding ahead of time how much ground to give. "He asked about the inventory work I did for his housekeeper," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Clara mentioned it to him. He was curious about the method." "About the method," Margaret repeated. "He has a bookkeeper who has been struggling with a supplier discrepancy. I explained the approach." Margaret was silent for a moment. She moved to the table and sat and arranged her skirts, and looked at Eleanor with the careful, measuring attention of a woman who had spent 30 years watching other people for advantage. "Nathaniel Brooks is not a man who makes casual conversation," she said. "I gathered that," Eleanor said. "He is also not a man who concerns himself with other people's domestic arrangements." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I imagine he has enough to manage with his own." Another silence. Eleanor drank her coffee, and did not look away, and did not elaborate, and did not fill the silence with the kind of nervous addition that Margaret had learned over years to exploit. Margaret's eyes moved to the notebook on the table beside Eleanor's cup. Eleanor moved her hand very slightly so that it rested beside the notebook without covering it, a gesture that looked unconscious and was not. Nothing to hide, nothing of interest, just numbers. "We leave after the midday meal," Margaret said finally. "Be ready." She left. Eleanor sat for a moment after the door closed. Then she took a slow breath. Round 1. She went looking for Clara before the morning was out. She found her in the cellar, taking her own accounting of the stores with a slate and chalk, her expression carrying the grim satisfaction of a woman who now knew exactly where the problem had been and was calculating how much it had cost her. "You're still here," Clara said without looking up from her slate. We leave after midday, Eleanor said. I wanted to ask you something first. Clara made a mark on her slate. Ask. Nathaniel Brooks, does he involve himself often in other families' affairs? Clara did look up then. She studied Eleanor for a moment with eyes that missed very little. He involves himself, she said carefully, when he believes something is wrong, and the person it's wrong against doesn't have the standing to fight it themselves. He's done it twice that I know of. Once with the Haley family, the father died, and the brother-in-law tried to seize the land on a debt claim that didn't hold. Nathaniel found the flaw in the contract and brought it to the circuit judge. What was the outcome? The widow kept her land. Clara set down her chalk. The brother-in-law left the county within a year. People have long memories here. Eleanor nodded slowly. And the second time? Clara's expression shifted. Something more careful moved into it. The second time was different. A man named Prescott. He had tenant farmers on his land who'd been there 15 years. Good people paid their rents, maintained the property. Prescott decided he wanted the land back and started inventing breach of contract claims to remove them. She paused. He had a lawyer and a judge in his pocket, and the whole thing was moving through very fast. What did Nathaniel do? He bought Prescott's debt, Clara said. He had heard that Prescott owed money to a creditor in Alexandria. He bought that debt. And then he walked into Prescott's office and told him that the debt was now callable immediately in full unless Prescott chose to reconsider his plans regarding the tenant families. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Did it work? She said. The families are still on that land, Clara said. 6 years later. She picked up her chalk again and turned back to her slate in the manner of a woman who considered the story complete. Eleanor stood in the cellar for a moment, turning this information over in her mind, like a stone she was checking for weight. He does not do things by halves, she said. No, Clara said. He does not. A pause. Neither I think do you, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor looked at her. Clara did not look up from her slate. Eleanor went back upstairs. She had 40 minutes before she needed to be ready to walk back. She used them. The Brooks estate had a library. Not a grand one. This was not a house built for performance, but a working library, the kind where the books were shelved by use rather than by appearance, where certain volumes showed the soft-edged wear of repeated consultation. She had been in it once before briefly 2 summers ago, when Thomas Whitmore was still alive, and had brought her along with something approaching open acknowledgement. She went there now and found what she was looking for in under 10 minutes. Virginia Estate Law Practices and Precedents. 1809 edition. She did not take it from the shelf, she was not in a position to borrow it, and she knew it. But she stood at the shelf, and she read, moving quickly through the index, finding what she needed. Testamentary capacity. The law required for a will to be valid that the testator be of sound mind at the time of signing. Not merely alive, not merely physically present, of sound mind, aware of the nature of the act, aware of the extent of their property, aware of the natural objects of their bounty, meaning the people they would naturally wish to provide for. A man, in the final weeks of a fever, whose hand shook and whose thoughts came loose from their moorings, who had grabbed his daughter's hand in a lucid moment and said the lower drawer before the fever pulled him back under. She stood at the shelf for a long moment. Then she heard Cecilia's voice somewhere above her calling for the maid, and she closed the book and left the library. She was at the front of the house, her travel bag over her arm and her notebook in her hand, when Nathaniel Brooks came down from the porch. He did not approach her directly. He moved in the direction of the carriage where the Whitmore driver was making final preparations, where Cecilia and Dorothea were already installed inside, where Margaret was saying her farewells to Adelaide Hartwell, with the practiced warmth of a woman who viewed social obligations as investments. Eleanor watched him and said nothing. He stopped near the front of the carriage. He said something to the driver too low for Eleanor to hear. The driver nodded. Nathaniel moved to the carriage door, and Eleanor watched him exchange a few words with Margaret. Brief, courteous words, the social formality of a host completing his duties. Then Margaret said something back, and Nathaniel turned his head very slightly toward Eleanor. And then he did something so small that no one watching could have assigned it a meaning. He looked at Margaret and said at normal conversational volume, the kind that carries Mrs. Whitmore, "I wonder if I might ask a favor. I've been trying to fill a position on the estate someone to manage the correspondence and accounts. Miss Whitmore showed some aptitude there yesterday with the household inventory. I'd like to speak with her before you go if she can be spared for a few minutes." Margaret's expression performed two calculations in rapid succession, both of them visible to Eleanor because Eleanor had learned to read that face the way a sailor reads weather. Calculation 1, is this a threat? Calculation 2, is this an opportunity? The social math resolved in under 3 seconds. Nathaniel Brooks was the most powerful landowner in the county. A connection to him, even a second-hand one, even through the vehicle of Eleanor, whom Margaret considered an inconvenience, was worth more than the minor discomfort of releasing Eleanor for 5 minutes. "Of course," Margaret said warmly. "She is entirely at your disposal." Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. He had the grace not to look satisfied. They stood at the side of the house, out of direct view, and he spoke quickly and quietly. "I spoke with Carver this morning," he said. "What did he say?" "Less than I wanted, but enough." Nathaniel's expression was contained, precise. "The amended will was filed on March the 3rd. Your father died on March the 19th. The witnessing solicitor was a man named Dodd, works out of Fredericksburg, not local, brought in specifically for that document." Eleanor felt something cold move through her chest. "He was brought from Fredericksburg." "Yes." "Because a local solicitor would have known my father, would have known his condition." "That would be my reading," Nathaniel said. Eleanor thought about March 3rd. She could place herself precisely on that date. She had been in the kitchen making broth because the cook had gone to tend a sick sister, and Margaret had declared herself too occupied, and the broth needed to be made. She had spent 3 hours in the kitchen making broth, while her father in the upstairs room had apparently been signing his name to a document prepared by a stranger. "I want to go to Richmond," she said. "I know. I don't have $15. Nathaniel was quiet for exactly 1 beat. "I wasn't going to raise that," he said. "I know. I'm raising it." Eleanor met his gaze. "I will not take charity, Mr. Brooks. If you lend me the money, I need to know what terms you'd consider fair repayment." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the expression of a man who was recalibrating something he had assumed, and finding the recalibration necessary and not unwelcome. "The inventory work you did yesterday," he said slowly. "Clara tells me you found the Hensley discrepancy in 40 minutes. She also tells me you wrote it up in a form that I can take directly to the county sheriff as evidence of fraud." "I can write documentation," Eleanor said. "Yes. My estate accounts are audited every July. My bookkeeper produces the reports, and they are reviewed by a surveyor from Fredericksburg, who charges $40 per visit and has never once found anything my bookkeeper missed, which I have always found either reassuring or suspicious, and I've never been sure which." "You want me to audit the audit," Eleanor said. "I want someone with your eye to look at 6 months of estate records before the surveyor arrives," Nathaniel said. 3 weeks' work. The equivalent value would clear the $15 and leave a balance. Eleanor looked at him. "I am not in a position," she said carefully, "to explain to Margaret Whitmore that I am spending 3 weeks working at the Brooks estate without her authorization." "No," he agreed. "You are not. But," Eleanor continued, thinking as she spoke, "I am technically still in possession of my father's written permission to conduct business on behalf of the Whitmore household, which was granted to me 18 months ago and has not been formally revoked." A silence. "Is that document enforceable?" Nathaniel said. "I don't know," Eleanor said. "But I know that Margaret would find it very uncomfortable to challenge it publicly, because doing so would require her to explain exactly what my status in the household is, which she has been carefully avoiding doing in any official capacity." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "How long," he said, "have you been building that particular line of reasoning?" "Since approximately mile 7 this morning," Eleanor said. "On the walk here." Something happened in his eyes. Not a smile. Something older than a smile. The recognition one careful person extends to another careful person when they understand they are looking at a kindred mind. 3 weeks, he said. Starting Monday. Starting Monday, Eleanor said. She turned and walked back toward the carriage before Margaret could send someone to look for her. The walk home was 11 miles. Eleanor counted every one. But for the first time in 6 months, her feet knew where they were going. The house at Whitmore Farm went quiet after 11. Eleanor waited until she heard Margaret's door close, and then Cecilia's, and then the particular thick silence that meant everyone who mattered to the management of the household had retired. She lit her candle. She went to her father's study. The study had been largely reorganized in the months since Thomas's death. Margaret had moved through it with the systematic attention of a woman conducting an inventory of assets, removing correspondence and files, and stacking them in the boxes that had then disappeared into Margaret's own rooms. What remained was the detritus that Margaret had considered unimportant old farming almanacs, survey maps of parcels sold before Eleanor was born. Letters from men who were themselves now dead. Eleanor was not looking for those. She was looking for something her father had almost told her about, the lower drawer. She went to his desk. The lower drawer on the left side, the one he had meant, she was certain, because it was the only one with a lock. Though the lock had been broken for as long as she could remember, and the drawer ran slightly off track when you opened it, Margaret had clearly looked here. The contents had been gone through, visibly things stacked with the particular tidiness of someone else's organization, not her father's. But people who looked for documents looked for documents. They did not always look for what was behind them. Eleanor removed everything from the drawer and set it carefully on the desk. Then she reached into the back of the drawer, feeling along the inner rear panel the way she had seen her father do once years ago when she was small and had wandered into the study at a wrong moment, and he had closed the drawer quickly and told her it was nothing. Her fingers found the edge, a thin gap, a strip of resistance that resolved when she pressed it correctly into a false back panel, not deep, no more than an inch, and behind it folded flat, 2 pieces of paper. She took them to the candle and read them. The first was a letter, dated January of this year, 6 weeks before the amended will, 2 weeks before the fever peaked. Her father's handwriting, but careful, deliberate. Written by a man who knew his time was running and was choosing every word. Eleanor, if you are reading this, certain things have happened that I was not able to prevent. I am sorry for them. I should have done this differently, given you your mother's house outright before it could be complicated. I did not, and I have been a coward about it, and I am trying now to at least leave you a clear picture. The house on Maple Creek Road is not mine. It was your mother's. It was never included in the estate that Margaret controls. I paid the taxes on it under my name for 17 years as a matter of discretion, but the original deed is in your mother's name. You are her heir. The deed should be in the county clerk's office in Clover Creek. Margaret does not know about it because your mother and I kept that arrangement private. There is a school there. That was your mother's intention. I think it was always your intention too. I am sorry I made you walk behind things, Eleanor. I should have made you walk beside. Your father. Eleanor sat at the desk for a long time. The candle burned down 1/4 inch. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying was something to be done later in its proper time, when the practical decisions had been made and the path forward was clear. Crying in the middle of the road didn't get you any further down it. She read the letter twice more. Then she read the second document. It was shorter. A single page in her father's handwriting dated the same day as the letter. Not a will. Not a legal document in the formal sense. But a sworn and signed statement witnessed, she saw with a start, by 2 names she recognized: Samuel Hatch, who ran the mill, and Dorothy Crane, who had been her mother's closest friend, and who still lived 3 miles outside of town. The statement said simply that Thomas Whitmore of sound mind affirmed that his daughter Eleanor was the rightful heir to the property on Maple Creek Road, and that any document signed after February 1st of this year was signed under circumstances he could no longer vouch for. February 1st, 1 month before the amended will. Eleanor looked at this document for a long time. Her father had known. He had known what was coming, what was being planned around him, while the fever came and went, and his grip on his own story loosened, and in his last clear weeks he had done what he could. A hidden letter and a sworn statement, and 2 witnesses who were still alive. It was not everything. It was enough to start. She was at the county clerk's office the next morning before it opened. She waited on the steps with her notebook in her hands and her face arranged into the composed, unhurried expression she had perfected for situations where showing urgency would give someone else an advantage. The clerk, a man named Dutton, who was about 60, and had the temperament of a man who preferred paperwork to people, arrived at 9 o'clock and stopped when he saw her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, not unwelcoming, cautious. "Mr. Dutton, I need to look at a property record. A deed originally filed in my mother's name. Catherine Ann Whitmore née Alderman. The property on Maple Creek Road." Dutton looked at her for a moment. "That record would be 17 years old at least," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I know." Another moment. Then Dutton unlocked the office door and held it open, and Eleanor followed him inside, and the day began in earnest. Chaman. The deed existed. Of course it did. Catherine Ann Alderman later. Catherine Whitmore had purchased the property on Maple Creek Road with her own inheritance money in 1799, before Thomas Whitmore, before Eleanor, before any of the complications that came after. She had registered the deed in her own name and paid a lawyer in Richmond to ensure it remained so, and when she had died 11 years later, the deed had passed by law to her surviving child. Eleanor Whitmore had owned a property for 11 years and not known it. She sat across from Dutton's desk while he pulled the records and spread them on the table between them, and she read every word of the original deed, and she read the transfer documentation, and she read the tax records. Her father's name on those, as the letter had said, paid under his account to maintain discretion, and she turned over every page with the careful, steady hands of a woman who was building something in her mind. "Can I have certified copies?" she said. Dutton looked at her. He looked at the stack of records. He looked back at her. "This is going to be complicated," he said, "with the estate as it is." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It will be." She met his gaze. "Mr. Dutton, I have been walking 11 miles behind a carriage for 6 months. I am not afraid of complicated." Dutton was quiet. Then he pulled out his seal and his certification paper. "I'll have them ready by Thursday," he said. "Thank you," Eleanor said. She stood. She was at the door when Dutton said, with his eyes still on his desk, "Your mother was a good woman, Miss Whitmore. She taught my youngest daughter to read. Back before things changed." A pause. "I always thought it was a shame the way things went." Eleanor stopped. "Yes," she said quietly. "It was." She walked out into the summer morning with the deed in her mind, and the letter in her notebook, and a property on Maple Creek Road that had been hers since she was 13 years old. And she thought, one day this road will end. She had said that to herself on every walk she had ever made behind that carriage. She had not known until this morning that she already owned the land it led to. She was 3 miles out of town walking the road home when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She moved to the side of the road without turning around the way you did in the country when a horse and rider were coming fast. The horse slowed as it came alongside her. She looked up. Nathaniel Brooks. He looked down at her from the saddle. He took in her expression, which she knew from long practice was telling him very little, and then he looked at the notebook under her arm, which was telling him slightly more. "You went to the clerk's office," he said. "I did," she said. Dutton sent word. Nathaniel's voice was neutral. "He thought I should know someone was pulling old land records on property near my southern boundary." Eleanor looked at him. "The property on Maple Creek Road," she said, "was my mother's. I am her heir." A silence. Something moved across Nathaniel's face, not surprise exactly, more like the settling of something that had been trying to align. "The old schoolhouse," he said. "You know it." "I know the property. It sat empty 8 or 9 years. I looked at purchasing it once before I knew the full ownership history." He paused. "I withdrew when I found the deed was complicated." "It is no longer complicated," Eleanor said. It is entirely straightforward." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him. The road stretched between fields in both directions, and the July sun was doing what it always did at midday, pressing down without apology. And Eleanor stood in it with her chin level and the deed and her mother's intention, and 41 children, and a schoolhouse, and 3 weeks of account work, and a $15 consultation in Richmond, all stacked in her mind like clean solid lumber. "Monday," she said. "Monday." Nathaniel agreed. He turned his horse and rode back toward the estate. Eleanor watched him go. Then she turned and walked toward home. 4 miles. She counted them the way she always did, not to suffer the distance, but to own it. The road did not know yet what it was carrying. But Eleanor did. Monday came the way important days always do, quietly without ceremony, as though the calendar had not registered what it was carrying. Eleanor rose before dawn. She dressed carefully, not in her best. She had learned long ago that appearing too prepared gave people information they could use against you, but in clean-pressed clothing that said, "I am here to work," without saying anything else. She ate quickly. She packed her notebook, her pencils, the certified copies Dutton had ready by Wednesday, as promised, and her father's letter, which she had read so many times now that she knew it without looking. She told Margaret she had been engaged for account work at the Brooks estate, under the household authorization letter. She set it the way you set down a heavy object, carefully, without drama, watching where it landed. Margaret looked at her across the breakfast table for a long, airless moment. "For how long?" Margaret said. 3 weeks, Eleanor said. The silence that followed had weight to it. Eleanor could see Margaret calculating the same 2-track calculation she always ran: threat versus opportunity cost versus position. The Brooks connection still outweighed the discomfort. Barely. "You will report anything discussed on that estate," Margaret said. "I will conduct account work," Eleanor said. "That's all I've been engaged to do." She picked up her bag and walked out before Margaret could reframe the conversation into something that required a different answer. Clara met her at the kitchen entrance and took her directly to the account room without preamble, which Eleanor appreciated. There were 6 months of ledgers stacked on the table, organized by month, with a note from Nathaniel's bookkeeper, a man named Gibbs, who had apparently been informed of the arrangement and was not entirely pleased about it, clipped to the front. "The records are in order. I have noted this only as a formality." Eleanor sat down. She opened the first ledger. By mid-morning, she had found 3 discrepancies that Gibbs had either missed or decided were unimportant. By noon, she had found 7. They were small, the kind of small that accumulates into large over time, and they followed a pattern that she recognized from the Hensley account. The fingerprint of someone who understood that theft performed at a consistent low level was nearly invisible against the noise of a large operation. She kept working. She did not see Nathaniel until the afternoon, when he came into the account room without knocking, not rudely, simply in the manner of a man moving through his own house, and stopped when he saw the papers she had spread across the table in a configuration that bore no resemblance to how Gibbs had organized them. "You reorganized by vendor instead of by month," he said. "Month is how you record," Eleanor said without looking up. "Vendor is how you detect." He was quiet for a moment. "What have you found?" he said. She handed him the sheet where she had been tracking the discrepancies. He read it standing up, which she noticed the same way he read everything she suspected, like a man who did not like to let himself get too settled before he understood what he was looking at. 7, he said. 7 so far. I'm only through March." He set the sheet down. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, which she had not expected. "Walk me through the first one." She did. And then the second. He asked good questions, precise, specific, never ahead of what she had actually shown him. He did not perform understanding. He didn't have, which in her experience was rarer in men of his position than it should have been. When she had walked him through all 7, he sat back and was quiet. "Gibbs has been with me 4 years, he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm not saying it's Gibbs. I'm saying someone in the transaction chain is skimming, and Gibbs has not noticed, and the question of whether that's because he couldn't, or because he didn't look, is one you'll need to decide." Nathaniel looked at her. What would you need, he said slowly, to answer that question definitively? The original receipts, Eleanor said. Not the copies Gibbs has recorded, the originals from the vendors. If the originals match the ledger, Gibbs is innocent and the problem is upstream. If they don't, then the problem is here, Nathaniel said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, then he stood. I'll get you the originals, he said. He left the room. Eleanor picked up her pencil and went back to April. The originals arrived the next morning, delivered by Nathaniel himself in a flat wooden box without comment. Eleanor sorted through them for 3 hours. She matched every receipt against every ledger entry with the patient, methodical attention of a woman who had learned that the truth was always in the details, and the details always rewarded the person willing to stay with them. The originals matched the ledger in every case, which meant the problem was upstream. She went and found Nathaniel in the yard, where he was talking to one of his field managers about the south pasture fence. She waited until the conversation had concluded. He acknowledged her presence with a slight tilt of his head, which she had come to understand was his version of, "I see you one moment," and then she said, "The ledger is clean. Gibbs is clean. The problem is with the Hensley supplier account. Someone at the source is inflating the receipts before they reach your property." Nathaniel looked at her. "Same account," he said. "Same as my estate party." "Same account," Eleanor said. "And the same pattern I found in the estate party records. Which means this is not an opportunistic problem. It is a deliberate, ongoing operation targeting at least 2 accounts in this county." The field manager had quietly moved away. Nathaniel stood in the July heat and said nothing for a moment, and Eleanor watched him think the particular quality of stillness he had when he was processing something. Not the stillness of a man waiting for someone else to act, but the stillness of a man deciding what action he himself intended to take. "How many accounts does Hensley supply in this county?" he said. "I don't know," Eleanor said. "But if we could obtain 1 or 2 other landowners' records from the same period." "I can get them," Nathaniel said. "James Alderman and Porter Whitfield both use Hensley. They're men I trust." He paused. "This would be faster with your help." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I'm telling you." Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, not quite something else. Something in between that she was beginning to be able to read. "I'll send word today," he said. Eleanor nodded and went back to the account room. She was 3 steps down the hall when he said behind her, "Miss Whitmore." She stopped. "You could have found this and said nothing," he said. "The clean ledger. You could have told me Gibbs was the problem and let the upstream issue go unexamined. That would have been the simpler answer, and I would not have known the difference." Eleanor turned. "I would have known the difference," she said. She went back to the account room. It was Thursday of the first week when everything shifted. She had been working late, the afternoon light gone, and Clara having left a lamp and a plate of food on the table without comment when she heard voices in the hall outside the account room door, not raised, but tense. The particular register of a conversation that is trying very hard to remain controlled. She recognized Margaret's voice. Her hand went still on the page. Margaret was not supposed to be here. There was no social occasion. There was no reason for Margaret Whitmore to be at the Brooks estate on a Thursday evening in the middle of July, unless she had found out something that had made waiting until Eleanor came home feel like too long. Eleanor heard Nathaniel's voice respond. She could not make out the words, only the cadence, even unhurried, carrying no apology. Then footsteps. Moving away. Then the door opened. Nathaniel came in and closed it behind him. He looked at Eleanor. She looked at him. "She knows you're here after hours," he said. "What did she say?" "She asked whether the scope of work had been discussed with her in advance, and whether I was aware that Eleanor Whitmore's standing in the Whitmore household was—" He paused, selecting the word precisely, "contested." Eleanor set down her pencil. "What did you say?" "I said that Miss Whitmore had presented a valid household authorization, and that I had engaged her on that basis, and that the nature of the work was account review, which would be completed in 3 weeks as agreed." "Did she push back?" "She tried." Nathaniel's voice was still even. "I told her that the Brooks estate was my property, and that the management of work engaged on my property was my decision, and that I looked forward to seeing her at the August gathering. Eleanor absorbed this. She won't let it go, she said. No. Nathaniel agreed. She won't. He moved to the table and sat. Not across from her this time, beside her, where he could see the work spread in front of her. Which is why I think you should tell me what you found at the clerk's office. Eleanor looked at him. She had not told him about the deed. She had not told him about the letter. She had kept those things close the way you kept a lantern close in a dark place, not because you were unwilling to share the light, but because you were not yet sure what the dark contained. She opened her notebook. She laid the certified copy of the deed on the table beside the account pages. She laid her father's letter beside that. She laid the sworn statement beside that. And she sat back and let him read. He read everything. Slowly, the way he did everything that mattered. He did not ask questions while he read. When he was finished, he looked at the table for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "She doesn't know about the deed." "No," Eleanor said. "My father kept it private for 17 years. There's no reason she would have found it unless she went specifically looking for property records in my mother's name, and she had no reason to look for those. So she controls the Whitmore estate," Nathaniel said, believing she controls everything. "Yes. But she does not control the property on Maple Creek Road. She has no claim to it." Nathaniel was quiet. "The schoolhouse on that property," he said. "What condition is it in? I haven't seen it in years. I was 8 the last time my father took me there." Eleanor paused. "He told me my mother had started a school for children whose families couldn't pay for a tutor. She ran it for 2 years before she got sick." She paused again. "I always thought it was something he told me to make her seem real to me. I didn't know she'd put the building in my name." Nathaniel was looking at the deed. "The building is still standing," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "I ride that road," he said simply. "I've seen it. It needs work. Roof has suffered, some windows are out, but the structure is sound. Good stone foundation." He looked up. "Your mother built to last." Eleanor did not say anything. There was a particular feeling that came with finding out that someone who had loved you had been more thoughtful than you knew. It did not feel like happiness exactly. It felt like being handed something heavy and precious at the same time, something that required both hands and your full attention, and was also a gift. She picked up her pencil. "We need to move on Richmond," she said, "before Margaret finds something to complicate the deed situation." "Agreed," Nathaniel said. "I've already written to Colton. He can see you Saturday next." Eleanor stopped. "This Saturday," she said. "That's fast." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "You wrote to him before I told you about the deed." "I wrote to him the morning after the estate party." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. "Why?" she said. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "Because I saw a woman walk 11 miles, he said, and not one person inside a carriage looked back. And I decided that was not going to continue without someone doing something about it." He paused. "I didn't know what the situation was yet. I knew it was wrong. That's enough to start." Eleanor held his gaze. "You take a lot on faith, Mr. Brooks," she said. "No," he said. "I take things on evidence. You kept your head up for 11 miles. He stood. "That's evidence enough." He went to the door. "The Richmond trip," Eleanor said. "I'll need a reason to be absent that Margaret won't question." Nathaniel paused at the door. "Clara's cousin lives in Richmond," he said. "She travels there twice a year to visit. She is always grateful for company on the road." He glanced back. "Clara has already offered." Eleanor looked at him. "You arranged that before I agreed to go," she said. "I arranged it so that you would have the option," he said. "There's a difference." He left. Eleanor sat alone in the account room with the deed and the letter and the sworn statement and the lamp burning low and a plan that was taking shape the way good structures do. Foundation first, then frame, then walls, then the roof that keeps everything else from being destroyed by weather. She picked up her pencil. She worked until midnight. The road to Richmond was 6 hours by coach, and Clara filled approximately 4 of them with conversation, which Eleanor had not expected, but found she was grateful for. Clara talked the way she worked efficiently, without waste, covering significant ground quickly and then moving on. She talked about the estate's history, and about Nathaniel's father, and about the 3 years in the early part of the decade when the estate had been in genuine danger, and Nathaniel had spent 18 months doing the work of 4 men to keep it. He doesn't talk about that time, Clara said. Why not? Eleanor said. Because he came out of it, and that's what matters to him. He doesn't see the point in dwelling. Clara looked out the window. He's not sentimental, but he is loyal. Those are different things. Yes, Eleanor said. They are. He hasn't offered to help anyone the way he's helping you since the Prescott situation, Clara said, not looking at Eleanor, still looking out the window in the manner of a woman saying something important that she didn't want to be seen saying too directly. I thought you should know that. Eleanor thought about what to say. I'm going to repay the $15, she said. I know you are, Clara said. That's not what I meant. Eleanor looked at her. Clara finally looked back. Her expression was not unkind. He's a careful man, Clara said simply. Careful about what he spends time on. Careful about who he gives it to. She paused. He's been careful for a long time. Eleanor turned and looked out her own window. So have I, she said. Clara made a small sound that might have been agreement and might have been something more, and then she changed the subject to the price of cotton, and they rode the remaining 2 hours in the comfortable silence of 2 women who had each said what needed saying. James Colton's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Merchant Row, up a narrow stair with a rope rail and a door that was slightly too small for its frame, requiring you to turn sideways to enter, which gave the impression, probably intentional, that the space beyond was more exclusive than it appeared. Colton himself was about 50, with the precise, unhurried manner of a man who had spent decades working with documents and had come to prefer them to people, though he was not unfriendly. He greeted Eleanor with a nod and looked at the documents she placed on his desk with the same focused attention she used on ledgers. I examined the amended will first. He read it entirely. Then he took from his desk drawer a magnifying glass, not a theatrical gesture, simply a tool, and examined the signature. He was quiet for a full 3 minutes. Eleanor sat across from him and waited. How long was he ill? Colton said without looking up. The fever began in early February. He died March 19th. And this is dated March 3rd. Yes. Colton set down the magnifying glass. He picked up the original will which Eleanor had obtained a certified copy of from Dutton and placed it beside the amended version. He studied both signatures. The pressure variation, he said more to himself than to Eleanor. See this here in the original, consistent downstroke weight throughout. The man knew what he was signing, and his hand knew it too. He moved his finger to the amended signature. Here you have 3 points in this signature, where the pressure drops significantly mid-stroke. It's not a tremor in the usual sense. It's the signature of someone who loses concentration partway through a familiar motion. Someone whose mind is not holding the complete shape of what they're doing. He looked up. This is not the signature of a man of testamentary capacity, he said. The room was very quiet. Can you put that in writing? Eleanor said. Yes, Colton said. I will need to examine the original. The certified copy will not serve for court purposes. But I can prepare a written analysis based on the copies today and a formal affidavit once the originals are produced. He paused. This will need to go to a circuit judge. There is one coming through Clover Creek in 6 weeks, Eleanor said. That's enough time. Colton set the documents together carefully. Do you have an attorney? Not yet, Eleanor said. Colton was quiet for a moment. There's a man named Henry Walsh. He practices here in Richmond, but he takes county cases when the situation warrants. He is good and he is honest, which in the legal profession is not always the same credential. He paused. He owes me a favor. I'll send him a letter. Eleanor looked at him. Why are you helping me? She said. Colton picked up the amended will and looked at it again. Because in 30 years, he said, I've seen this done to people more times than I can count. Someone gets sick, and people who stand to benefit from their death start making arrangements before the dying is finished. He set it down. And because Nathaniel Brooks asked me to look at this, and he has not yet asked me to do anything I was ashamed of afterward." He paused. "I don't imagine he's starting now." Eleanor nodded slowly. She wrote him a bank draft for $15 from the sum Nathaniel had advanced against the account work. Colton looked at the draft, then at her. "He told me not to charge you," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I'm paying you directly." A pause. Then Colton took the draft. "Walsh will contact you within a week," he said. "Keep your documents safe." Eleanor gathered everything into her notebook. She walked out of the building and down the narrow stair and onto Merchant Row, where Clara was waiting with the coach and a look that asked everything without speaking a word. "It's enough," Eleanor said. "It's enough to take to a judge." Clara nodded. She did not celebrate. She simply moved to the coach and opened the door. That was enough. Sometimes enough was exactly everything. The letter from Henry Walsh arrived on Wednesday. Eleanor intercepted it herself. She had been watching for it, making a point to be near the front of the house in the morning hours when the post came. She took it to the account room at the Brooks estate and read it 3 times. Walsh was direct. The situation as Colton had described it presented sufficient grounds for a formal challenge to the amended will. He would take the case. He would need the originals of her father's letter and sworn statement, plus Colton's written analysis, plus testimony from the 2 witnesses named in the sworn statement, Samuel Hatch and Dorothy Crane. He would need these things no later than 2 weeks before the circuit judge arrived. He also wrote at the bottom a single additional line that Eleanor read and then sat with. "For a long time, I understand the property on Maple Creek Road may also be relevant to these proceedings. If the deed situation is as described, that matter is considerably more straightforward than the will challenge, and could be resolved first, providing you a legal standing that would strengthen your position in the more complex case." Eleanor folded the letter. She went to find Nathaniel. "How is in the yard?" He listened to her summary without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once. "You need Hatch and Crane," he said. "I need them to testify, or at minimum to provide written affidavits if they can't appear in person." She paused. "I haven't spoken to either of them since my father died. I don't know how they'll respond." "Hatch is a man of his word," Nathaniel said. "He signed the original statement. He'll stand by it." "And Dorothy Crane." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Crane is 71 years old," he said carefully. "She lives alone. She has no particular reason to make herself available for a proceeding that will make her unpopular with Margaret Whitmore, who is still a woman of standing in this county." Eleanor absorbed this. "She might need a reason to feel safe," Eleanor said. "Yes." "What kind of reason carries weight with a 71-year-old woman who lives alone and is worried about making enemies?" Nathaniel looked at her. "The kind," he said, "where someone with property and standing in the county says publicly that he considers her testimony to be a matter of justice and that her position in this community will not suffer for giving it." Eleanor met his gaze. "You'd do that," she said. "I'd do that," he said, simply, without performance. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She had spent a great deal of her life in the company of people who offered things and meant less than they said, and she had developed over years of necessary carefulness, a very accurate sense for the difference between a promise that was furniture and a promise that was load-bearing. This one held weight. "I'll go see her tomorrow," Eleanor said. "I'll come with you," Nathaniel said. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." He paused. "Dorothy Crane knew your mother. She will want to see that her testimony is going toward something your mother would have recognized." Eleanor looked away toward the field. She did that sometimes when something hit a register that was too close to the bone, not to hide the feeling, but to give it a moment to settle before she responded. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." Dorothy Crane was 71 and small and sharp, and she opened the door of her house before they had finished tying the horse, which meant she had seen them coming and had been watching. She looked at Eleanor for a long time. "You have her eyes," she said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I've been told." "Come in," Dorothy said. I've had the kettle on since Tuesday. She looked at Nathaniel. Mr. Brooks, I wondered when you'd show up in this story. Nathaniel removed his hat. Mrs. Crane, don't stand in the doorway, Dorothy said. You're letting the heat in. They went inside. Dorothy poured tea with the steady hands of someone who had long since stopped being nervous about things that were merely difficult. She listened to Eleanor explain the situation in full. The amended will, Colton's analysis, Walsh's involvement, the deed, the letter, all of it without interrupting once. When Eleanor finished, Dorothy wrapped both hands around her teacup. Thomas asked me to witness that statement because he knew I would not be frightened out of it, she said. He said, she stopped, corrected herself. He said, Dorothy, you are the stubbornest person I know, and that is exactly what Eleanor is going to need. Eleanor felt something move in her chest. He was right about the stubborn, Dorothy said. Whether he was right about the useful is what we're determining. She looked at Eleanor directly. What exactly do you need from me? Your testimony, Eleanor said, before the circuit judge, or a sworn affidavit if appearing in person is too much. I will appear in person, Dorothy said. Mrs. Crane, it will not be comfortable. Margaret Whitmore. Margaret Whitmore has been uncomfortable to be around for 30 years, Dorothy said flatly. That's not a new condition. I am not going to let 30 years of discomfort become the last word on your mother's intentions for that schoolhouse. She set down her cup. Your mother taught 11 children in this county to read, including my grandchildren, before she got sick and ran out of time. She built that schoolhouse with her own money and her own plans, because she believed that every child deserved to be able to read their own name. A pause. She deserves to have it finished. The room was quiet. Nathaniel was looking at the wall. Eleanor could not see his expression. I will be at the courthouse, Dorothy said. Tell me when. They were half a mile from Dorothy's house, riding back in the afternoon heat, when Nathaniel said, Your mother taught his grandchildren to read. Yes, Eleanor said. So when you open that school, and you will open it, you're not starting something new. Eleanor looked at him. You're finishing something she started, he said. There's a difference. People understand finishing differently than starting. Starting you can dismiss. Finishing, that's a different thing to argue against. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. You think about things carefully, she said. I try, he said. You think about my things carefully, she said. That is what I meant. He was quiet. Is that a problem? He said. Carefully, as though the answer mattered more than the question. Eleanor looked at the road ahead. No, she said. It is not a problem. She did not say anything more about it. But the road felt shorter than it had this morning, and the summer air had gone to that particular quality it sometimes had in late afternoon, cooler, less insistent, and Eleanor Whitmore rode back toward Clover Creek with a deed in her notebook and a lawyer on her side, and 2 witnesses ready to stand, and a man beside her who thought about her things carefully. She did not have everything yet, but she had enough for the next step. And Eleanor had always known that enough for the next step was how you got to the end of a road. She kept her eyes on the distance. The circuit judge was coming in 4 weeks. Margaret did not know what was waiting for her, and Eleanor intended to keep it that way for exactly as long as she needed to. The week before the circuit judge arrived, Margaret found the letter. Eleanor did not know how. She had kept the copies locked in the account room at the Brooks estate, the originals tucked inside the notebook she carried on her person at all times. The letter she had found in her father's desk, the one addressed to her in his handwriting, the one that said, I should have made you walk beside, she had memorized, and then hidden inside the lining of her travel bag, sewn into the seam with 3 careful stitches she had made herself at 2 in the morning. What Margaret found was something else. Eleanor came home on Thursday evening to find Margaret sitting at the dining room table with a piece of paper in front of her, and an expression Eleanor had never seen on her face before. Not the cold calculation she was used to. Not the studied warmth Margaret deployed in social situations. Something rawer than either of those. Something that looked underneath all the performance like fear dressed up as fury. Sit down, Margaret said. Eleanor sat. You went to the county clerk's office, Margaret said. Eleanor said nothing. Don't insult me by denying it. Dutton told Alderman. Alderman told his wife. Adelaide told me this afternoon at the sewing circle. Margaret's voice was controlled, but her fingers on the table were not. They were pressed flat against the wood, the way you pressed something down when you were afraid it would get away from you. You've been looking into your mother's property. I have been reviewing records that pertain to me, Eleanor said carefully. Nothing pertains to you, Margaret said. You have no legal standing in this household. You have no claim. I have a deed, Eleanor said. The room went completely silent. Margaret stared at her. The property on Maple Creek Road. Eleanor continued, keeping her voice level and her hands still in her lap. It was my mother's. It transferred to me on her death. It has been mine for 11 years. She paused. I have certified copies. The originals are on file at the county clerk's office. Margaret's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession. Eleanor watched them all. The first was shock. Genuine, unguarded, the kind that happens before the calculating mind catches up with the receiving mind. The second was recalculation. Eleanor could almost see the architecture of Margaret's thinking shift, the frantic internal restructuring of a position that had just lost a wall. The third was the one Eleanor had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. Anger. Not cold anger. Hot anger. The kind that makes people dangerous. That property, Margaret said very quietly, has been maintained under this household's expense for 11 years. The taxes have been paid from this estate's accounts. The taxes were paid by my father, Eleanor said. As a matter of discretion, I have the records. The estate's accounts, Margaret repeated, which I manage, which means any expense paid from those accounts constitutes a claim. No, Eleanor said. Margaret stopped. Voluntary payment of a third party's tax obligation does not constitute a legal claim on that property, Eleanor said. I looked it up. Virginia Property Law, 1809 edition. I read it in Mr. Brooks's library. She paused. The property is mine, unencumbered. The silence stretched. Then Margaret said very precisely, You have been planning this. I have been finding things out, Eleanor said. There is a difference. You went to Richmond. Eleanor did not answer. You went with Clara Hatch, Margaret said, and something in the way she said Clara's name made Eleanor's chest tighten. You went to Richmond and you saw someone about your father's will. Eleanor still said nothing. She had learned from Nathaniel that silence correctly deployed was more powerful than most words. I am going to fight this, Margaret said. Whatever you think you have found, whatever documents you believe you have, I will fight it. I have standing. I have resources. I have an attorney who has worked with this estate for 6 years. She leaned forward. You have nothing but a dead man's letter and a piece of land with a broken building on it. Eleanor looked at her. She thought about Dorothy Crane's hands wrapped around her teacup. She thought about James Colton's magnifying glass and his 30 years of watching dying men's signatures. She thought about Henry Walsh's letter and Samuel Hatch, who was a man of his word and had signed a statement and would stand by it. She thought about 41 children. You may fight it, Eleanor said. That is your right. She stood. But I want you to understand something, Margaret. Not as a threat, as a simple statement of fact. She picked up her notebook. My father built this household. He built it honestly, and he maintained it honestly, and he loved it. He made mistakes, I know that. He was not always brave when he should have been, but he tried at the end to do right. She paused. I am going to let the judge decide what that means. I am not going to make it ugly if I can avoid it. Another pause. But I am not going to walk behind the carriage anymore. She left the room. Behind her, Margaret said nothing. That was the most frightening response she could have given. Eleanor went directly to the Brooks estate. It was after 7 in the evening. She had not sent word ahead. She arrived at the kitchen door because the main entrance felt like the wrong register for what she was bringing, and Clara led her in without a word and pointed toward the study. Nathaniel was at his desk. He looked up when she came in and read her face in the space of 1 second. She knows, he said. She knows about the deed, and she knows I went to Richmond, Eleanor said. She doesn't know about Walsh or the witnesses or Colton's analysis, but she's not going to sit still. No, Nathaniel agreed. She won't. He set down his pen. What did she say? Eleanor told him. Everything, including the part about fighting it, including the part about resources and standing, including the fact that she had not been able to read Margaret's final silence, and that silence from Margaret was the thing she trusted least. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. She'll go to Carver, he said. Tonight or tomorrow. She'll ask him to find anything that can delay the proceeding or challenge your standing to bring it. Can Carver find something? Eleanor said. Carver is thorough, Nathaniel said. That's both his value and the problem. He paused. There's one thing she could use if Carver finds it. Eleanor felt something cold move through her. What? She said. Your household authorization letter, Nathaniel said. The one you used to engage work here. It's 18 months old. If Margaret formally revokes it in writing before the proceeding, it creates an argument that your activities over the past 3 weeks were conducted without proper authorization, which could be used to challenge the admissibility of certain documents. Eleanor stared at him. The Colton analysis, she said. If I'm argued to have obtained it under irregular circumstances, it complicates things, Nathaniel said. Walsh can navigate it, but it costs time, and it gives Carver an argument. He looked at her. We need to move the deed proceeding first exactly as Walsh suggested. Get the property into your name officially before the will challenge. That gives you independent standing that doesn't depend on the authorization letter. How fast can that happen? I spoke to Walsh yesterday, Nathaniel said. Eleanor stopped. You spoke to Walsh? She said slowly. I rode to Richmond on Tuesday, Nathaniel said. I wanted to understand the full timeline. He met her gaze steadily. I should have told you I was going. Yes, Eleanor said. You should have. A pause. I'm sorry, he said. Not deflecting, not explaining, just I'm sorry. Eleanor looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching, without the careful self-justification most people deployed when an apology might cost them something. What did Walsh say? She said. He can file for deed confirmation Monday. That's a simple proceeding. The records are clean. There's no competing claim. It's documentation rather than argument. The judge can sign off on it in an afternoon. He paused. Once your name is on that deed officially, you're a property owner of record in this county. That's standing. Real standing. The kind that's hard to argue around. Eleanor absorbed this. And the will challenge, she said. Walsh files that Thursday. 2 days later, Colton's affidavit will be submitted simultaneously. Dorothy Crane and Hatch will testify Friday. Eleanor was quiet. The whole thing mapped out in days. 4 days from now to standing in front of a circuit judge with her mother's deed and her father's letter, and 2 witnesses, and 30 years of James Colton's expertise, and a lawyer who owed Colton a favor, and a landowner who had ridden to Richmond on a Tuesday, without telling her, because he was a man who did things, and sometimes forgot that the person the things were for deserved to know about them. You've been managing this, she said, without telling me. I've been supporting it, Nathaniel said. There's a difference. That, Eleanor said carefully, is my line. Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the contained precision of it, something almost rueful moving through. You're right, he said. I overstepped. You did, she agreed. And I'm grateful, and I'm angry about it simultaneously, and I don't think either of those things cancels the other out. No, he said. They don't. She looked at him. Going forward, she said, you tell me what you're doing before you do it. Yes, he said, without hesitation. All right, she said. Then tell me everything Walsh said. He did. Friday morning. Margaret revoked the authorization letter. It arrived by courier to the Brooks estate at 9 o'clock. A formal witness document signed by Margaret Whitmore, stating that all authorizations previously granted to Eleanor Whitmore to conduct business on behalf of the Whitmore household were rescinded effective immediately. Eleanor read it in the account room. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. The way you look at something you expected and were still not entirely ready for. Clara came in and saw her face. "What is it?" Clara said. Eleanor handed her the document. Clara read it. Her expression tightened. "She moved fast," Clara said. "She always does," Eleanor said, "when she's afraid." She picked up her notebook and went to find Nathaniel. I was already talking to Walsh. Walsh had ridden from Richmond Thursday night, it turned out, because Nathaniel had told him to be ready, which was the kind of thing Eleanor was now understanding about Nathaniel Brooks. He moved the pieces into position before he announced the game was starting. She was less annoyed about it than she had been the night before. "The revocation," Walsh said, looking at the document Eleanor handed him, "is actually helpful." Eleanor stared at him. "She's revealed that she considers you a threat significant enough to act against preemptively," Walsh said. "That's a statement about her awareness of the situation. Carver advised her to do this, which means Carver has identified the authorization letter as a vulnerability, which means they're working defensively." He set the document down. "Defensive position. We're ahead." "Does it affect the Colton analysis?" Eleanor said. "Colton was engaged in his professional capacity and submitted a professional opinion," Walsh said. "The authorization letter has no bearing on that. What it affects is the narrative Margaret will argue that you were operating outside your authority. We counter by demonstrating that you were operating within your legal rights as your mother's heir and your father's natural daughter, both of which are statuses that predate and supersede any household authorization." He looked calm in the manner of a man who had seen worse situations resolve correctly and trusted the process because he understood it. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was watching her. "Monday," she said. "Monday," Walsh confirmed. The courthouse in Clover Creek was a plain building with a good roof and adequate windows and the particular smell of old paper and linseed oil that courthouses in small Virginia counties tended to have. Eleanor had been inside it once as a child, when her father had taken her to watch a land survey proceeding, because he believed children should understand how property worked, and once at 19, when she had gone alone to register a small transaction on Thomas's behalf. She walked in. Monday morning with Walsh beside her and Nathaniel 3 steps behind. Present she noticed but deliberately not in front of her, positioned in a way that said support rather than authority. She noticed that. She filed it. The deed proceeding took 40 minutes. The records were presented. Walsh made a short, clear argument. The opposing position represented by Carver was that the payment of taxes from the Whitmore estate accounts constituted an implied claim. Walsh cited the same statute Eleanor had read in Nathaniel's library. The judge, a man named Aldous Reeves, about 60, with the unhurried precision of someone who had been making decisions in small courtrooms for a long time, read the relevant section twice. Then he signed the deed confirmation. Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, property owner of record. The land and building on Maple Creek Road, Clover Creek, Virginia. It took 40 minutes. 11 years of not knowing, and it took 40 minutes to make it official. Walsh shook her hand outside the courthouse. Nathaniel stood on the steps and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said right at that moment. Eleanor stood in the July sun with the certified confirmation in her hands and felt the weight of it. Not the lightness she might have expected, but the weight, the specific gravity of something real becoming yours. Then Carver came down the steps behind them and stopped. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Nathaniel. His expression had the quality of a man reassessing a situation he had misread. "Miss Whitmore," he said, carefully. "Mr. Carver," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Whitmore will appeal the interpretation," he said. "She may," Eleanor said. "I want you to understand that this is not—" He stopped, restarted. "My client has interests that—" "Mr. Carver," Eleanor said quietly and without heat, "I think you are a thorough attorney who has done his job competently in service of a client whose instructions were based on information that was not complete." She paused. "I don't believe you knew about the amended will when you filed it. I think you were handed documents and told they were in order, and you had no specific reason to doubt that at the time." Carver was very still. "The question now," Eleanor said, "is what you know and what you do with it." A long silence. "The Thursday proceeding," Carver said. His voice was different. Something had gone out of it, the professional smoothness that covered the calculations. What was left was a man in his 50s who had been in rooms like this for 30 years and knew what the evidence was going to say before it said it. "I need to advise my client of her options." "That seems wise," Eleanor said. Carver nodded once. He walked away without looking at Nathaniel. Nathaniel watched him go. "He's going to tell her it's over," he said. "Possibly," Eleanor said. "Or he's going to tell her to settle." "Same thing," Nathaniel said. "Not quite," Eleanor said. "Settled means negotiated. I need to know what I'm willing to accept before Thursday." Nathaniel looked at her. "What are you willing to accept?" he said. Eleanor thought about this honestly, the way she thought about things that mattered without performance, without the comfortable answer sitting with the real one until it showed itself. "The schoolhouse is not negotiable," she said. "The property is not negotiable. My father's personal library, which was named in the original will, that's not negotiable." She paused. "The Whitmore farm is Margaret's. I don't want it. I never wanted it. I want what was mine and my mother's, and I want it confirmed so clearly that there is no room for future dispute. And the amended will, I want it voided," Eleanor said. "Not because of what it cost me financially, because it was done to a man who was dying and didn't have the capacity to refuse it, and that should be on the record." Nathaniel was looking at her with an expression she had learned over the past 3 weeks to pay attention to the expression he got when something she said landed somewhere real in him. "That's not a financial position," he said. "That's a moral one." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is." Howe was quiet for a moment. "Walsh can argue both," he said. "But the moral argument is the harder one to win on legal grounds." "I know," she said. "I'm asking for it anyway." Margaret came to the Brooks estate on Wednesday. Eleanor had not expected that. She had expected Carver another formal letter, another procedural move, the chess game continuation of a position that was running out of moves. She had not expected Margaret herself arriving at the main door at 11 in the morning, alone without Cecilia or Dorothea, without the performance of social occasion. Clara came and found Eleanor in the account room. "She wants to speak with you," Clara said. "Alone." Eleanor set down her pencil. "Where?" she said. "The front parlor," Clara said. "Mr. Brooks offered it." "Where is Mr. Brooks?" Eleanor said. "He said to tell you he'll be in the yard if you need him," Clara said. "And that the decision about whether to speak with her is entirely yours." Eleanor sat for a moment. Then she stood and went to the front parlor. Margaret was standing at the window when Eleanor came in. Not sitting standing, which was itself information. A seated person is settled. A standing person is ready to move. She turned when Eleanor entered. She looked. Eleanor took stock of this carefully tired, not defeated. Margaret would never look defeated. But the particular tiredness of someone who has been holding a position under pressure and is beginning to feel the cost of it in their body. "I'm not going to apologize," Margaret said. "I didn't expect you to," Eleanor said. "I made decisions that I believed were in the best interest of this family," Margaret said. "Of my daughters, of the estate your father built." "I understand that you believe that," Eleanor said. "Don't condescend to me," Margaret said sharply. "I'm not," Eleanor said. "I mean it genuinely. I understand what you were doing and why. That doesn't make it right. But I'm not going to stand here and pretend I don't know what it is to make decisions out of fear for the people you love." She paused. "Your daughters will be fine, Margaret. The estate is yours. I'm not asking for anything that was ever truly yours." Margaret was quiet. "Carver says you'll win Thursday," she said. "Walsh says I'll win Thursday," Eleanor said. "I imagine they're saying the same thing." "He says they will succeed on the signature evidence alone," Margaret said, "before the witnesses even speak." Eleanor said nothing. "He says I should settle," Margaret said. "Accept the original will's provisions, acknowledge the deed, and end the proceeding before it becomes a matter of public record." She paused. "I want to know if that is what you want." Eleanor looked at her. "What I want," Eleanor said carefully, "is for it to be on the record that the amended will was signed by a man who was not capable of knowing what he was signing. Not because I need the courtroom victory, because he deserves for the truth of that to be documented." Margaret's jaw tightened. "That will reflect on me," she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "It will." The silence stretched between them. Eleanor waited in it without flinching, without softening it, without offering Margaret a way out of the consequence she was asking about. "And if I were to acknowledge it," Margaret said very quietly. "Acknowledge the circumstances, in the settlement, not in open court." Eleanor thought about this. She thought about what Nathaniel had said. The moral argument is the harder one to win on legal grounds, and she thought about Walsh's practical timeline, and she thought about 41 children and the schoolhouse on Maple Creek Road that needed a roof. She thought about what she actually needed versus what she wanted, and she held those two things honestly against each other. "If the settlement acknowledges the circumstances," Eleanor said slowly, "and restores the original will's provisions in full, and confirms the deed without challenge, I would accept that." "It would need to be private," Margaret said. "It cannot be entirely private," Eleanor said. "Carver and Walsh will both know. Colton's analysis will remain on file. But the proceeding itself—" She paused. "I am not interested in destroying your daughter's futures, Margaret. They did not make these choices." Something moved across Margaret's face. Small, quickly controlled, but Eleanor saw it. "Thursday," Margaret said. "Carver will have the settlement terms to Walsh by tomorrow morning." "I'll review them with Walsh," Eleanor said. Margaret moved toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "You are very like her," she said. She did not say who. She did not need to. "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm told she was stubborn." "She was principled," Margaret said. There was something in her voice that might have been a very old, very complicated feeling that had never been properly named. "There is a difference." She left. Eleanor stood in the parlor alone. She stood very still for a moment, feeling the weight of the last 3 weeks settle through her, the deed and the letter and the witnesses and Richmond and the account room and 11 miles of road walked behind a carriage, feeling all of it at once. The exhaustion and the anger and the grief for her father's hands, and the particular specific grief for a woman she had never really known, who had built a schoolhouse and died before she could fill it. Then she heard boots on the porch. Nathaniel stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. "How bad?" he said. "She's settling," Eleanor said. He exhaled. "It's not over," Eleanor said. "The settlement terms come tomorrow, but—" She stopped. "It's over." Nathaniel nodded slowly. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not celebrate. He just looked at her with that quiet, steady attention he had, the kind that did not need to perform itself. "Sit down," he said, "before you fall down." Eleanor looked at the chair beside her. She sat down. Nathaniel sat across from her. They sat in the front parlor of the Brooks estate in the July heat. And neither of them spoke for a long moment, and it was the most restful Eleanor had felt in 6 months. "The schoolhouse," she said finally. "We'll look at it this weekend," he said. "I know a man who does good roof work." "I'm not asking you to pay for the roof," Eleanor said. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm telling you, I know a man." Eleanor looked at him. "You're going to keep doing this," she said. "Finding men who know things." "Probably," he said. "I'm going to keep being annoyed about it," she said. "Probably," he said. A pause. "All right," she said. Something moved between them in the quiet of the room, not yet named, not yet spoken, but present the way certain things are present before they are acknowledged. The kind of thing that had been building in 11 miles of road and 3 weeks of account ledgers and a trip to Richmond and a conversation with a 71-year-old woman who said you have her eyes and a man who rode to Richmond on a Tuesday because he was a man who did things. Eleanor picked up her notebook. She turned to the page with the 41 names. She added a small mark beside each one. "Coming." She did not say it out loud, but she thought it clear and certain as a deed filed at the county clerk's office. "I'm coming." The settlement terms arrived Thursday morning, exactly as Carver had promised. Walsh read them first. Then he handed them to Eleanor without comment, which was itself a comment. Walsh was not a man who withheld his opinion, unless the document spoke clearly enough that his opinion would only crowd the room. Eleanor read them at the table in the account room. Nathaniel sat across from her and did not read over her shoulder, which she appreciated. The terms were clean. The amended will was acknowledged in the language of the settlement to have been executed under circumstances that did not meet the standard of testamentary capacity. The original will was restored in full. Eleanor received her father's personal library. 17 boxes of books, maps, and correspondence that Margaret had been storing in the East Wing under the guise of organization. The deed to the Maple Creek Road property was confirmed without challenge, with a formal withdrawal of any implied claim arising from tax payments. A small sum, the income from Eleanor's portion of the farm, calculated from Thomas Whitmore's death through the present, was to be paid in quarterly installments over 2 years. Eleanor read the document twice. She set it on the table. "It's everything I asked for," she said. "It is," Walsh said. "And the acknowledgement of circumstances is in the document," Walsh said. Paragraph 4. "It will be filed with the court as a sealed record. Carver's language is careful, but the substance is there. It says what needs to be said." Eleanor looked at paragraph 4. She read it 3 times. It said what needed to be said. She picked up the pen. She signed it. Walsh witnessed it. He gathered his copies. He stood and shook Eleanor's hand with the direct, undemonstrative warmth of a man who did his work well and found that sufficient. "The library will be delivered next week," Walsh said. "I'll ensure the timeline is met." He nodded at Nathaniel. "Brooks." He left. The room was quiet. Eleanor sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. Then Nathaniel said, "How do you feel?" It was such a simple question, and he asked it so plainly, without any of the performance that people usually wrapped around. Questions like that, the tilted head, the careful tone, the implicit suggestion that the correct answer was a particular kind of fine, that Eleanor was caught off guard by it. She thought about it honestly. "Like someone just put down something I've been carrying so long, I forgot it wasn't part of my body," she said. Nathaniel nodded. He understood that kind of weight. He had told her so on the road back from Dorothy Crane's house. The 18 months after his father died, the work of 4 men, the specific exhaustion of fighting to keep something that should already have been yours. "What do you do now?" he said. Eleanor looked at her notebook. "Now," she said, "I go see the schoolhouse." They rode out to Maple Creek Road on Saturday morning in the early hours before the July heat took full hold of the day. Clara had packed food and water. Nathaniel's roofer, a man named Bram, who was about 40, and spoke almost exclusively in assessments of structural integrity, rode with them, and spent the journey looking at the sky in the way men who work outside look at weather. Eleanor had not been to the property in 16 years. She remembered it the way you remember places you visited as a child, larger than they turned out to be, the distances between things distorted by a scale you no longer carried. She remembered her father lifting her down from the wagon, and her mother's hand, warm and particular, the specific weight of it. She remembered the smell of new wood. She remembered a sign above the door that her mother had painted herself in careful letters that a woman who had learned to write in her own kitchen had made as legible as a printer's work. The sign was gone now. Weather had taken it years ago, but the iron hooks were still in the frame above the door, and Eleanor stood and looked at them for a moment before she went inside. The building was one-room stone foundation, as Nathaniel had said, wood frame above. The roof had lost shingles in sections, and the light came through in places it shouldn't, falling in irregular patterns across the floor. 3 of those windows were out. The floor itself was solid, good wide planks dried and settled by years, not rotted. A fireplace on the north wall with a sound chimney. Along the east wall, barely visible under dust and weather damage, the remnants of shelving that Eleanor recognized from the one clear memory she had of being inside this building. Her mother lifting her to see the top shelf, saying, "Those are the readers. Eleanor, those are for the children when they've learned their letters." Bram walked the room twice, knocked on things, looked at the ceiling, looked at the floor, made sounds. 3 weeks, he said. Roof is the main thing. Windows are straightforward. Floor needs cleaning, not replacing. Chimney's good. He looked at Eleanor. You want it done right or done fast? Done right, Eleanor said. 3 weeks, he said again, as though that were the answer to both. Eleanor nodded. Nathaniel stood near the door and watched her move through the space. She was aware of him watching and did not mind it. His attention had never felt like surveillance. It felt like the way a careful person watches something they want to understand. She stopped at the east wall. She reached out and touched the remnant of the shelving, a single bracket that had held all these years against the wall. She built the shelves herself, Eleanor said. Not to Nathaniel specifically, to the room. My father told me that. He said she ordered the lumber and she planned the measurements and she built them herself because she said no one else would build them the right height for children. Nathaniel was quiet. She sounds like someone who knew what she wanted, he said. She knew exactly what she wanted, Eleanor said. She just ran out of time. She turned around. I'm not going to run out of time, she said. It was not a vow exactly. It was a statement of fact delivered in the tone of someone making an accounting clear present without embellishment. Nathaniel looked at her. No, he said. You're not. The library arrived the following Wednesday. 17 boxes delivered by 2 men from the Whitmore farm who carried them with the careful neutrality of people being paid to move things and not paid to have opinions about what they were moving. Eleanor had them brought to the Brooks Estate account room, which Nathaniel had offered as temporary storage. She unpacked every box herself. She cataloged every volume, every map, every piece of correspondence that her father had kept 30 years of a man's intellectual life. The evidence of what he had read and thought and cared about, the books he had used to teach her when no school would take her, and the tutors his wife had suggested tended to find reasons to decline. Among the books she found 3 she had not known existed. 2 were primers, simple reading books, the kind used in schoolrooms, worn with use. Inside the front cover of both, in her mother's handwriting, Maple Creek School, Catherine Whitmore, 1800. The third was a journal. Not her father's handwriting, her mother's. Small, careful letters, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write as an adult and had spent years making it something she was proud of. Eleanor sat at the account room table and held the journal for a long time before she opened it. Then she opened it. The first entry was dated April 1799. The last was September 1802, 8 months before her mother died. She did not read it all that day. It was not the kind of reading you did in one sitting. It was the kind of reading that required you to put it down periodically and walk around the room and look at the ceiling and let the person on the page become real to you in stages, rather than all at once, because all at once would be too much. But she read the first entry. April 4, 1799. The land on Maple Creek Road is mine, and I have put it in my name and paid good money to a lawyer to be certain it stays that way. Thomas does not entirely understand why I want it separate, but he is a good man, and he does not ask me to explain myself twice. I want it separate because I have a plan for it, and I want the plan to be mine. The school will be mine. Not Thomas's, not the county's, not anyone's who might decide later it isn't worth having. Mine. For the children. I counted 11 children in this county last month who cannot read their own names. I intend to fix that before I am done. Eleanor set the journal down. She looked at the ceiling. 11 children in 1799. 41 in 1816. Her mother had counted. She had always counted. Eleanor picked up her pencil and her notebook and wrote, "Begin with the 41. Finish what she started." The school opened the first Monday of September, not grandly. Eleanor did not have the nature for grand openings. They felt like performances, and she had spent enough of her life performing survival that she was disinclined to perform success. Instead, she sent word to the families she had identified, the ones she had been tracking in her notebook for years. The Millers, the Hatches, the Beaumonts, the families along the Maple Creek Road, whose children walked past the building every day and had never been inside it. She sent word that the school would be open, that there was no fee, that any child between 5 and 14 was welcome. that they should bring nothing but themselves and a willingness to sit still for 2 hours. 17 children came the first day. Eleanor stood at the front of the room and looked at them, their faces alert and cautious in the way of children who had been told that wanting something was risky, and she felt something she did not have a precise word for. Not happiness exactly, though it was adjacent to that. Something more like rightness. The sensation of a thing arriving in the place it was always supposed to be. "Good morning," she said. A few of them said it back. Some looked at each other. One small girl in the front, she was 6. Eleanor would learn one of the Beaumont girls. The youngest of the 3 looked at Eleanor with the direct, unguarded attention of someone who had not yet learned to moderate her curiosity, and said, "My mama said you used to have to walk behind a carriage." The room went very quiet. Eleanor looked at her. "I did," she said. "Why?" the girl said. Eleanor considered the question, the way she considered all important questions honestly, and without the comfortable shortcut. "Because some people believed that where I walked said something about who I was," she said. "They were wrong, but it took some time to prove it." The girl thought about this with the serious concentration of a 6-year-old processing new information. "Are you going to make us walk behind carriages?" she said. Several of the older children laughed. Nervous, startled laughter. The kind that happens when something accidentally punctures attention. "No," Eleanor said. "I'm going to teach you to read, so that when someone tries to tell you where you belong, you can read the law yourself and find out if they're right." The girl nodded, satisfied. She folded her hands in her lap. Eleanor picked up the first primer. "We'll start," she said, "with your names." Nathaniel came to the school on the 3rd day. He did not come inside. He stood at the door, not to observe, she understood, but to see that it was real, that it was standing, that it was filled with the sound of children saying letters aloud, with the effortful concentration of people learning to do something new that they understood mattered. Eleanor saw him from across the room and nodded once. He nodded back. He left. He came again the following week, and this time he did come inside, because Eleanor had sent word that the east window was sticking, and she needed someone taller than herself to examine the frame. He looked at the window frame. He identified the problem, a warp in the wood from the repair work, not serious, and said he would send Bram. "I can handle a sticking window frame," Eleanor said. "I know you can," he said. "Bram is faster." He looked around the room. The shelves were full now, not the original ones which had been beyond saving, but new ones that Bram had built to Eleanor's specifications, the right height for children, as her mother had insisted. The primers were lined up. A small chalkboard purchased with the first installment from the Whitmore settlement covered most of the north wall. "How many?" Nathaniel said. 23 now, Eleanor said. "Word got to the Henderson family over the ridge. They sent 4. He nodded. She watched him look at the room with that quiet, taking stock attention of his, and she thought not for the first time that he was a man who was moved by things, but had never learned to show it in the usual ways. He showed it in what he did. Instead, the letter to Colton, before she asked the conversation with Dorothy Crane, the roofer named Bram, who showed up on a Saturday, the window frame. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He looked at her. "You did all of it," he said. "You made it possible to do," she said. "There's a difference," he said. They had said those words to each other so many times over the past 2 months that they had acquired a specific weight between them, a shorthand for something more complex than either of them had yet named directly. Eleanor looked at him. "Yes," she said. "There is." A pause. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name without the formal prefix. She noticed. He noticed that she noticed. "I am not a man who speaks easily about things that matter to me," he said. "I do them instead. I know that is not always." He stopped, collected himself. "I know that is not always what a person needs. I have been told before that it is not enough." Eleanor waited. "I do not know," he said, "if you are in a position to consider. I know you have spent the past months reclaiming something that was taken from you, and I am aware that the last thing you need is someone else making decisions about what belongs in your life without asking." "Nathaniel," she said. He stopped. You rode to Richmond on a Tuesday, she said. You found Colton before I knew he existed. You told Dorothy Crane her position in this community would not suffer for telling the truth. You sent Bram on a Saturday morning. She paused. I have been watching you do things for 3 months. I am not unaware of what they mean. He was very still. I am also, she continued, a woman who has spent 6 months being told where she belongs by other people. I am not interested in having that repeated in any form, however kindly intended. I know, he said. That is not. I am telling you what I need, she said. Not what I don't want. There's a difference. He understood immediately. She saw it. What do you need, he said. To do this first, she said. The school. The 41 children. The shelves at the right height. The thing her mother started. I need to do this and know that it is mine. That it stands because of what I built, not because of who stands next to me. Yes, he said, without hesitation. Without the careful qualification most men would have inserted. And then, she said, I would like to take a walk. A pause. A walk, he said. Down the Maple Creek Road, she said. When I'm ready, together, not one in front and one behind. She held his gaze. Beside, Nathaniel Brooks stood in the doorway of the school that Eleanor Whitmore's mother had built, and Eleanor Whitmore had reclaimed and filled with 23 children, learning to say their own names. And he looked at her with the expression she had learned over 3 months to read, the one that was quieter than a smile, older than a smile. The expression of a man who had been careful for a long time and was looking at something he had not let himself expect. Beside, he said, yes. John. October came, and the heat finally broke, and the road to Maple Creek School had a name now. People in Clover Creek called it School Road, which was not official, but was understood the way things in small communities become understood through collective use, rather than formal designation. 31 children came on the first Monday of October. Eleanor wrote the number in her notebook beside the 41 names she had been carrying for years. 31 down. 10 to go. She would find them. She always found them. The ones who stood outside the dry goods store watching other children carry books home and said nothing because they had learned that wanting things not offered to you was its own kind of pain. She knew that particular pain from the inside, which made her very good at recognizing it from the outside. Dorothy Crane came to the school on a Tuesday in late October, unannounced the way she did everything without performance as a simple fact arriving. She sat in the back of the room for an hour and watched Eleanor teach. She did not speak. She watched the children with their slates and their effortful concentration and the particular pride that crosses a child's face when they write their own name for the first time and understand what they have done. When the children had gone home, Dorothy sat at the back of the empty room, and Eleanor sat in the front, and they looked at each other across the space where 23 children had been making noise an hour ago, and was now the specific quiet of a place that knows what it's for. Your mother would have been insufferable about this, Dorothy said. Eleanor looked at her. Insufferable, she said. She would have crowed, Dorothy said. She was not a humble woman about the things she cared about. She would have said, I told you, Dorothy. I told you it would happen. I told you from the first day, and she would have been absolutely right and absolutely impossible about it. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. She would have been so proud of you. Eleanor looked at the chalkboard. Her own name was written there from the morning lesson. Eleanor. 7 letters. The first thing she had taught them. She built the shelves the right height, Eleanor said. She thought about everything, Dorothy said. That was her. Every detail. Every child. She used to say, she stopped. Started again. She used to say that if you paid attention to the details of a person's life, the way they learned, and what made them laugh, and what frightened them, you could teach anyone anything. The content was never the problem. The relationship was the whole thing. Eleanor sat with that. I'm learning that, she said. You already knew it, Dorothy said. You've been doing it your whole life. You just didn't have a room to do it in. Eleanor looked around the room. The shelves, the chalkboard, the repaired windows, the stone foundation that had been built to last and had. "I have a room now," she said. Dorothy stood. She moved toward the door with the deliberate steadiness of a 71-year-old woman who had decided she was not done with things yet. At the door, she stopped. "The girl," she said. "The little Beaumont girl. The one who asked you about the carriage." Annabelle, Eleanor said. "She's 6. "She is going to be something," Dorothy said. "I can tell already." "Yes," Eleanor said. "She is." Dorothy went out. Eleanor sat alone in the school for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook. She opened it to the page where she had written, "Begin with the 41. Finish what she started." Below that she wrote, 31. Finding 10 more. Below, that one more line in the small, precise handwriting she had developed over years of columns and numbers and things that needed to be recorded accurately. Annabelle Beaumont. Age 6. She is going to be something. The last twist came on a Friday in November. Eleanor had not expected it. She was in the school after hours correcting the week's slate work she had begun, assigning short written exercises, simple ones copying a sentence from the board, because the act of copying forced you to look at the shape of words, rather than just the sound of them, when she heard a horse outside, and then footsteps, and then a knock at the door that was not Nathaniel's knock. He knocked differently. She had learned his knock. She opened the door. Philip Carver. She had not seen him since the Monday of the deed proceeding, when he had walked away from her on the courthouse steps, with the expression of a man reassessing a situation. She had received no further communication from him. The settlement had been handled through Walsh entirely. He looked different from the last time. Not diminished. Carver was not the kind of man who diminished easily. But something in the professional smoothness was different. Less armor, more face. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I apologize for the hour." "Come in," Eleanor said. He came inside. He looked around the room, the shelves, the chalkboard, the slates, the small, careful work of 31 children's handwriting laid out on the front table. He looked at it all with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read. "I have something to give you," he said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "I found this in the estate files while I was finalizing the settlement documentation." It was in a folder that had been misfiled, whether intentionally or by error, I cannot say with certainty. Eleanor took the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a letter in her father's handwriting. Not to her. To Carver himself, dated December of the previous year, 2 months before the fever peaked, 2 months before the amended will. She read it. "Carver, I want to formalize what I have only said privately. Eleanor is to have the Maple Creek property outright, the library entire, and the income from the east pasture in perpetuity. I know the current arrangement is informal, and I know you have advised me to put it in the will proper. I am putting it here for now, and will do the will formally in January. Please keep this letter on file. T. Whitmore." Eleanor stood very still. Her father had told Carver. He had told him 2 months before he died. He had told him what he intended. And this letter had been in a folder in the estate files, misfiled whether intentionally or by error, while Carver had managed the estate through a settlement that had given Eleanor exactly what this letter said her father wanted her to have. She looked up. "Did you know?" she said. Carver held her gaze. "I found it 3 weeks ago," he said, "when I was closing the settlement files." 3 weeks ago, she said, after the settlement was signed. "Yes," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "The settlement already gave me everything in this letter," she said. "Yes," he said. "It did." A silence. "Then why are you bringing it to me now?" she said. Carver was quiet for a moment. "Because it belongs to you," he said. "Not as a legal instrument, the settlement supersedes it, but as," he paused, looking for the right word with the care of a man who used words precisely, "as a record of what he wanted, what he told me he wanted in his own hand when he was still entirely himself." He paused again. "I thought you should have it." Eleanor looked at the letter. Her father's handwriting, clear and steady. December, when he had been well, when his hands had not shaken. Eleanor is to have the Maple Creek property outright, the library entire. He had always meant it. He had always meant for her to have it. He had just run out of time to do the will properly, and then the fever had come, and the people who stood to benefit from his death had moved faster than he had. But he had told Carver. He had put it in writing. And Carver had found it and brought it to her because it belonged to her not as law, but as truth. "Thank you," she said. Carver nodded. He looked around the room one more time. "How many children?" he said. 31, Eleanor said. "Growing." He nodded again. He moved toward the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He stopped with his hand on the frame in the exact position Margaret had stood in the Brooks parlor 2 months ago, which Eleanor noticed and thought was perhaps a posture people adopted when they were leaving a room and wanted to say one more thing they hadn't planned to say. "Your father used to speak about you. In the office when we were reviewing documents. He would mention small things. What you were reading. Something you had said about the accounts." A pause. "I was proud of you. I thought in case no one had told you that directly, I thought you should know it." Eleanor held her father's letter in both hands. "Thank you," she said again. Carver left. Eleanor stood alone in the school in the November evening, and she held the letter, and she let herself feel fully and without management all of the things she had been keeping carefully organized and at practical distance for 8 months. She let herself feel the grief for her father, which was not just grief for his death, but grief for the courage he had almost had for the letter he had written to Carver, and the will he had meant to update in January, and the daughter he had been proud of and had not always found the words to tell. She let herself feel the grief for her mother, whom she had been coming to know in stages through the deed, through Dorothy's words, through a journal she was reading 10 pages at a time because it required care. A woman who had counted 11 children and built shelves the right height and run out of time and left everything in Eleanor's name because she had known somehow that Eleanor would come back to it. She let herself feel all of it. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it in her notebook behind the certified copy of the deed and in front of the page with 41 names, and she picked up her pencil and she went back to correcting the children's slates. Annabelle Beaumont had written her name 11 times on her slate, not because she had been asked to, because she had wanted to, because she had discovered that her name written in her own hand was something no one could take back from her. Eleanor looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote in the margin in her small, precise hand, "Very good, Annabelle." She found Nathaniel at the fence line of the south pasture, which was where he often was at the end of the day when the work of the estate had been managed, and he allowed himself the particular stillness that came with standing somewhere open and looking at something larger than the immediate problem. He heard her coming and turned. She held up the letter. He read it where he stood without moving to take it from her. She held it, and he leaned and read in the particular physical negotiation of two people who had learned each other's habits over months and moved around them without announcement. When he finished, he straightened. He said nothing. She said nothing. The November air was cool, and the light was going, and the south pasture stretched out in all directions with the specific piece of land that has been well tended by someone who intended to stay. "He told Carver," Eleanor said finally. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He always meant for me to have it," she said. "Yes," he said. "He just—" She stopped. "He ran out of time." Nathaniel looked at her. "You didn't," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said. "I didn't." The last of the light was going now. Going in the way it did in November quickly, without the long negotiation of summer just present, and then less present, and then gone. And Eleanor Whitmore stood at the fence line of the Brooks South pasture with her father's letter in her hand, and 31 children's names in her notebook, and a school on Maple Creek Road with shelves at the right height, and she thought about the road. The 11 miles. The dust on her shoes. The empty seat. The weight of her notebook against her ribs, and the 41 names she had been carrying since before any of this was possible. She thought about what she had said to this man months ago when she was ready, down the Maple Creek Road. Together, not one in front and one behind. Beside. "I'm ready," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "For the walk," he said. "For the walk," she said. He did not move immediately. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered, carefully taking the full measure, making sure he understood before he acted. Then he held out his hand. not to lead, not to guide. Palm up open offered the gesture of someone asking, not assuming. Eleanor looked at his hand. She had been asked in the past 8 months to accept a great many things. Charity. She had refused help. She had negotiated documents she had signed with careful attention to what they meant. She had been careful about every single thing she accepted because she had learned over 24 years that what you accepted shaped what you became. She looked at his hand. Open. Unhurried. Without performance. She took it. They walked. Not down the road to anywhere in particular, just out through the south pasture gate and along the fence line, as the last light left the sky. Two people walking beside each other in the particular easy quiet of two careful people who had found after a long time of being careful, someone worth being less careful around. She did not know, standing at that fence line with her hand in his, what came next, in the specific detailed sense. She did not know what the winter would bring to the school, or how many children would come in January, or whether Annabelle Beaumont would write her name 12 times on Monday or 20. She did not know what Nathaniel Brooks meant to her in the full named sense of what that meant, or when they would find the words for it. She knew he was honest. She knew he was patient. She knew he rode to Richmond on Tuesdays when he believed something was wrong and did not wait to be asked. She knew she had walked 11 miles behind a carriage and kept her chin up, and that he had been the first person in 6 months to ask why. She knew her mother had built shelves the right height and left the land in Eleanor's name, and counted 11 children and run out of time, and that Eleanor had 31 children and was not going to run out of time. She knew that the road they were walking now, this evening in November, with the sky going dark and the pasture grass dry underfoot, and the sound of the school 2 miles behind them settled and real, and hers, this road felt like the one that came after all the other roads. The one that was not a march, not a penance, not a demonstration of endurance, just a road. Walked beside someone, at her own pace, going where she chose. Eleanor Whitmore kept her chin up, and she kept walking. The school on Maple Creek Road educated 114 children over the next 7 years. In 1823, the county formally recognized it as Clover Creek's first public schoolhouse. The sign above the door, repainted by Dorothy Crane in the autumn of 1817, read Catherine and Eleanor Whitmore School. Dorothy said it was Catherine's name first because she had started it, and Eleanor's name second because she had finished it, and that was the correct order of things, and she would not hear otherwise. Annabelle Beaumont learned to read in 3 months and spent the rest of her childhood reading everything she could find. In 1830, she became the first woman in Clover Creek to publish a letter in the county newspaper on the subject of public education. She signed it with her full name. Nathaniel Brooks and Eleanor Whitmore were married in the spring of 1817 in a quiet ceremony attended by Clara Dorothy Walsh and 31 children who had been explicitly told to sit still and mostly did. Eleanor kept her notebook, the 41 names, the columns and the counts and the careful records of things that mattered. She kept it until the pages were full. Then she started a new one.